Today's guest speaker is Professor Pia Pagnelli. It is my pleasure to welcome her and introduce her. She is one of the leading scholars of Adam Smith and 18th century political economic thought. She has a PhD and an MA in economics from George Mason University, and she also has an MA, a BA from uh, the Catholic University of Sacred Heart in Milan. And she also is a two-time Fulbrighter, both times in Chile to study the impact of Adam Smith's ideas, if I'm not wrong, on Chile's banking system. So her expertise spans Scottish Enlightenment, uh, behavioral economics, evolutionary biology, and even neuroscience. Beside publishing regularly in leading economic thought journals such as History of Political Economy, Journal of History of Economic Thought, and History of Economic Ideas, she has published major works on Adam Smith, such as Routledge Guidebook to Adam Smith's Wealth of Nation, uh, the Oxford Handbook of Adam Smith, and Economic and Rousseau, Ethics, Politics, and uh, Economics. Professor Pagnelli is perhaps one of the most energetic and globetrotting scholars on Adam Smith. For example, in 2023, when it was the 300th birth anniversary of Adam Smith, she went gave uh, went to 19 universities around the world to give lectures on Adam Smith, and she's currently president of History of Political Economy Society and International Adam Smith Society. And her favorite book, is unsurprisingly written by Adam Smith, which according to her is one of the best books ever written. And take a wild guess. It is not Wealth of Nation. It is the Theory of Moral Sentiments. So when Dr. Fahim asked me to moderate this session, I instantly said yes. There are a couple of reasons. First, it is a welcome break from conventional seminars, not to say not important, because this seminar, her talk, goes to the roots of intellectual economic thought in philosophy, which is the basis of most of the economics that is being taught today. And secondly, when I was at the New School, it was all Marx there. I was interested in Smith, but unfortunately, Heilbronner, who was a scholar on Adam Smith, had died at that time. So I was itching to ask a couple of questions on Adam Smith. I'm not sure whether they would be related to her talk today, but still I will ask them. So the title of a talk is Whose Interest Conflicts with Invisible Hand? And it is, I think, paper written jointly by, I have forgotten the name of the gentleman, and it is a work in progress. So over to you, Professor Pagnelli.
So thank you so much for the great introduction. It is a great pleasure for me to be here, and I appreciate the help in organizing this. As was said, the paper is called Whose Interest? Conflict with Invisible Hands, and is joint work with Jimena Hurtado from Universidad de los Andes in Colombia. You can interrupt me at any time. I'm happy to take questions as I go along, as well as I will try to keep the presentation short to open it up for questions. So there's much more, for me, more interesting than just me talking and listening to myself. So this work started with us thinking about the invisible hand and the way in which it is usually presented. In most books, textbooks, and also specialty books, it is often presented in terms of the self-interest of an individual is what allows us to have a functioning invisible hand, right? So if we follow our self-interest, if we pursue our self-interest, we can end up in a situation in which we unintendedly benefit society. And that's the standard story. So it's always self-interest, self-interest, self-interest. In The Worldly Philosopher, as a matter of fact, there is a quotation, which is probably one of the most famous sentences from The Wealth of Nations, which is, "It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own," and in The Worldly Philosopher, self-interest. After the publication of The Worldly Philosopher, which was a very, very popular book, in many texts, the quotation within quotation marks was actually from their regards of their own self-interest. But when you actually look at the text from The Wealth of Nations, Smith doesn't use the word self-interest. He uses the word own interest. And also in there's something off the screen, sorry. This is the citation for the invisible hand itself. And again here, by pursuing his own interest, you frequently promote that of society, even if it's unintendedly. So Smith uses own interest, not self-interest. And it's an interesting slip that we went from own interest to self-interest, because the two things are actually not the same. And there was mention of the first book that Adam Smith wrote, which is The Theory of Moral Sentiments. And I think is not an accident that Smith uses own interest in both the most two famous sentences that are cited, and not self-interest. Because self-interest has a different connotation than own interest. Self-interest, both today and in the 18th century, meant I care about my interest so much that I will disregard your interest. I don't take into consideration other people. I am willing to step over other people to benefit myself. And that's not what Smith said. Smith said own interest, because own interest means I care about myself, but I also have regard of your interest. So I take you into consideration as well when I make a decision, as opposed to think only about myself. That's a big difference. So the standard understanding that we have, at least on a surface, of in economics, when we say that self-interest is a driving force, the implication is we don't care about others. Smith, being a moral philosopher, cared, and he understood that we do care about others. This is why the butcher, the brewer, and the baker care about your interest as well as their interest. But you don't steal the dinner, right? You appeal to their interest and they appeal to your interest. If it was a self-interested act, then they would actually steal. The person who was looking for dinner could steal the dinner, could beat, like use violence to get dinner. But that's not what Smith says. Right? You engage the other person's interest with your own interest. But that's not the whole story that Smith told us. So on the one hand, we do have this focus on own interest, which means I do take into consideration the other person. But there is a dark side of interest as well. this is what I just said, like there are two different definitions. They're not the same concept. The dark side is that there is self-interest in the wealth of nations, but it's not a positive thing. If you actually search in the work, self-interest does not come up ever. There's one mention of self-interest in the wealth of nations, and is attributed to the minor clergy. But otherwise, there's always interest, own interest, but never self-interest. That doesn't mean, though, that in the wealth of nations there is not self-interest. There is. It's just not presented as such, but is presented as its definition. There are people who are willing and able to put their own interest above everybody else, disregarding the other people. And so I apologize, there's a lot of things that are not quite on screen. But it is possible to have situations in which the pursuing of self-interest is actually going against the interest of society. And we analyze 4 situations. One is then when there is a difference in bargaining power. One is when there are differences in understanding your own interest. One is when there are asymmetry or differences in access to state power. And a final one, when there are different levels of institutional stability. So what I will do is go through the 4 of them to explain the situations in which not your own interest, but your own self-interest actually causes problem. Sorry, it's a little bit off again. So this is, for me, the most interesting example of the problem that self-interest causes. Because this is an example in which we are in the market. Right? So the same market where you have the butcher, the baker, and the brewer allowing you to buy dinner, it's the same market. You have buyers and sellers. You have buyers and sellers of labor. The buyers of labor are masters. There was a word that was used in the 18th century for employers, and the working poor. And Smith tells us this is a market condition. Like there's no government interference at the moment. But you have the 2 parties, the buyers and the sellers, with different bargaining powers. The masters tend to be relatively wealthy. They don't have to be very wealthy, but they are wealthier than the working poor. The working poor are working poor. And the masters are few. The working poor are many. Being few allows them to get together and collude, what we would say today. And it's very easy because, again, you have a handful of masters who tend to be in the same place, mostly in urban environment. So it's very easy for them to get together at dinners or at other social events. And what Smith says, in any of these events, they tend to conspire against the public. The working poor cannot do that. They are too dispersed. There are too many of them, so they cannot cartelize as it would do the masters. The other problem that we have is that masters, again, being wealthier than the working poor, in negotiation, in wage negotiation, they can say, fine, if you're not coming to work at this wage, I'm not going to hire you. The working poor could do the same and say, well, if you don't give me the benefits that I want, I'm not going to come to work. But who can actually hold out the most? The working poor, being working poor, cannot sustain themselves for long without working. So they have to eventually get back to work to sustain themselves and their family. Masters, on the other hand, being wealthier, they can hold out for longer. So they can wait out until the working poor are in starving condition and they're basically push themselves back into work. The only alternative that they have, according to Smith, is violence. So that you have riots, you have threats of violence from the working poor, because that's the only tool that they are left with in wage negotiation. So again, here we are in a market, but when you have these imbalances of bargaining power, the situation is not very easy. And in this case, the masters can act in their own self-interest, and they do act in their own self-interest. This is regarding the well-being of the poor, of the workers. And again, this for me is very interesting because it's a pure market condition. The situation becomes even worse when the masters are able to affect legislation, as they do, according to Smith. When the masters are able to affect legislation, they now have in place the force of the state to make sure that the workers accept their condition. The workers are by law prevented from cartelize, from getting together. That's not a law against the cartelization of the masters. The masters have access to power, to legislation, and so they dictate what the workers can or cannot do. So they use the force of the state to create a situation in which it is impossible for the worker to move out of their situation. Why do they do it? Because they can benefit themselves with lower wages. If the wages are kept low, the profits can be higher. So this is, again, in a situation in which you're not pursuing your own interest, you're pursuing your own self-interest. And when you're pursuing your self-interest, disregarding the interest of others, then what you're going to have is a conflict between your interest and the interest of society. They don't move in the same direction anymore. Smith also is very careful in distinguishing different interests. So yes, we're all pursuing our own interest, but we are not all the same. Okay. So Smith divides three people into three different groups, each of which has its own interest. The landlords have an interest that actually is in line with the interest of society. Because as a landlord, I would like my land to be more productive, and therefore I'm producing more, and that benefits society. So the interest of the landlords is in line with the interest of society. The problem is, according to Smith, that the landlord do not understand it. The landlords are not interested in productivity. The landlords are interested in, Smith says, ornaments. They're interested in fancy clothes, in fancy dinners, in fancy dances, or in fancy parks, not necessarily in improving the production of the land. And that's just because they don't have to work for a living. And so they just take for granted that whatever they have is there, or whatever they need is there. And not having to work for a living doesn't make them realize what their own interest is. And so even if their interest is in the same direction, goes in the same direction as the interest of society, they don't understand it. And so they do something else. The interest of the workers, according to Smith, also goes in the same direction as the interest of society. because the workers are the majority of the population. If they're well-being, if they are well, society is well. The problem is that the workers do not understand their own interest, mostly because somebody who's going to be a worker starts to work, Smith says, at the time between 6 or 8. And when you start to work at the age of 6 or 8 for 15 hours a day, 6 days a week, doing exactly the same task over and over and over again, you don't have the opportunity to develop judgment, to develop critical thinking, because all the things are done for you. You just need to push a button, basically, and there are no problems to solve. There's nothing you have to do but the same repetitive task over and over and over again. So Smith has very strong words about what happened to the development of the working poor. They basically don't develop mentally. Not because they're born that way, it's just because they don't have any stimulation to actually develop that critical capacity to understand what goes on. It's different from farmers, because even in the countryside, little kids start to work at 6 or 8, if not even younger. But in the countryside, as a farmer, you're confronted with a variety of tasks. And so you're actually able to develop some judgment and critical thinking just because of the differences in the activities that you have to engage, even if you start to work as a child. But in a factory, you don't. And so you don't understand what goes on just because you never had the chance. So you don't understand what your interest is, and you're subject to influences of factions. And so you can actually be in the street protesting for things that are going to go against yourself, just because you don't have that critical ability. Sure.
In your paper, in your perhaps your most influential paper, the Adam Smith problem in reverse, in which you have reversed the German schools, the Adam Smith problem, you have reconciled, theory of moral sentiment, self-interest, impartial spectator, and fellow feeling. So what you are saying right now, when does that kick in? I mean, because that is the sort of mediating force between self-interest of the type of self-interest that we talk today. So when does that kick in? I mean, because Adam Smith is very, vociferously talks about that fellow feeling and sympathy.
Right. So I'm going to use merchants and manufacturers to explain it, because I think that they're related. Merchants and manufacturers for Smith have an interest that goes against the interest of society. And the reason is a merchant and a manufacturer want to have prices as high as possible. And they want to have the market for themselves. Society, on the other hand, there will be a society that's achieved with lower prices and more competition. So the interest of merchants and manufacturers always goes against the interest of society. When do you see merchants and manufacturers? When you have profit opportunities. And the larger are the profit opportunities, the more there is the temptation to say, let me try to grab that profit for myself. So from the theory of moral sentiments, what Smith tells us is that we want people's attention. We want to be approved. We want to be loved. Of course, the starting point is actually we want to be lovely. We want to be approvable. We want to deserve the love of others. We want to deserve the approval of others. But there are two ways to do it for Smith. One is through virtue, and one is through wealth. Because we tend to admire the rich, and we tend to look down at the poor. The problem with pursuing virtue is that virtue is difficult to distinguish. So you have no idea whether I am a good person or not. You don't know me. Right? I could beat my children. I could steal whatever I have the chance. I could kick the homeless in the street. You would never know. So you have no way of saying whether I am a virtuous person or not, if you don't know me well. But you can tell that I'm not very poor because of my background, because of the way I look mostly. Right? So wealth is more recognizable than virtue. So if you want to attract people's attention, people's admiration, are you going to use virtue or are you going to use wealth? Well, ideally, both. Ideally, more virtue than wealth, but wealth is cheaper, right? Because it's flashy. You see, like, it's shiny. Virtue is not visible. And so it is easier to attract people's attention by showing off your wealth than by showing off your virtues. And what do we do with the wealthy? We admire them. And the wealthier you are, the more you are admired. So much so that we actually have, according to Smith, different standards to judge the rich and the poor. We are much more willing to ignore, dismiss, justify bad behaviors of wealthy people than of poor people. And I'm thinking like drug dealers, right? They do horrible things, but they're admired by a lot of people because they do have the flashy cars, they do have the flashy clothes, right? They're horrible individuals, but people love them because of the wealth that they display. So we tend to dismiss the fact that they have killed a bunch of people, that they've done a lot of bad things, and we just concentrate on the fact that they're wealthy. So when you have large profit opportunities, you're saying, oh, you know what? I'm going to go for it. And yes, I'm going to step on people's feet. I'm going to step on people's head. I'm going to hurt a lot of people. But if I gain so much that people will just admire me because of what I gained. So there are situations in which the opportunity to profit sort of make you dismiss the fact that there are others that can be hurt by your actions and make you concentrate on the possibility of achieving admiration from others by gaining a lot. Of course, Smith would say, if you have to steal, you're not going to steal a pen. You're going to steal, you're going to rob a bank. Like you're not going to rob somebody to get a pen. So you want to, when you do it, you want to do it big so that you can actually have enough gains to jump to a higher status and gain the admirations that other people would give you. So this is why the merchants and manufacturers, their interest is always against the interest of society because they want prices to be high. They want monopoly. And if they're able to do it, they're gaining a lot. The merchants and the brewer, the baker, and the butcher, there are not that large profit opportunities for them. So it's easy for them to behave virtuously and to ask you for the correct price for their bread, their meat, and the beer. But for big merchants and manufacturers, the profit opportunities are very large. So let's see if we can actually get them for ourselves at your expense. So I think the psychological game that Smith describes in the theory of moral sentiment explains these differences.
But when we compare other societies, other civilization like civilization in China, civilization in India, they were completely different. they based on mutual understanding, they based on mutual respect, and they were working together. So it seems like that this theory was produced for Europe, then they imposed this theory on other areas. This is not reflecting the cultural behavior of other areas, of other regions, particularly of China, particularly of subcontinent, particularly of Arab countries. If we look under the cast of thought, most of the people, they were collaborating with each other, otherwise they could not survive. They were living in agricultural areas where collaboration was very important, self-sacrifice was very important. On the other side, European community was very selfish community. People were individualists, and therefore Smith wrote something about their individual behavior. Moreover, Smith said that invisible hand, then invisible hand is missing. In classical economics, when Adam Smith was considered the father of classical economics, and he is considering that there should be minimal role of the government, then why he is coming with subjective judgments? That's again a contradiction. So can you kindly explain that if that is only to Europe, why Smith's those considerations were imposed on other areas, like I mentioned, where people were living in collaboration? Thank you.
Again, Smith is a child of his time, and we can't ask him not to. That said, he was very well read, and he tried to read as much as possible from all sort of sources. He talks about China, but the way in which he talks about China is to describe the corruption of the mandarins, the corruption of government officials. So it may be true that there are some forms of collective actions, collective thinking, but what he focuses on for China in particular is the fact that you do have government officials that are looking for themselves at the expense of the poor. And so they are extracting from the poor more than what they should to benefit themselves. And what caused the consequences are stagnation. Right? Because if you deprive somebody from the fruits of their labor, as Smith would call it, you take away incentives to innovate. And so China, for Smith, is actually an example of a society that is not growing because, in part, the corruption of government officials. He talks about India, but mostly in terms of the British taking over India. So it doesn't talk about the culture that is present before the British, but it talks about the East Indian Company being, I don't know, find a nice word, an evil extracting institution that destroys whatever is under their control. So it talks about other, both India and China. China is, as I mentioned, in terms of the corruption of government, and India, the corrupting presence of the East Indian Company more than the actual culture that was there before. He actually praises the Indian continent before the arrival of the British, in terms of there was a large, strong culture. And so the British had to fight much more in India than in North America to conquer or to colonize the land. But that's the extent of what Smith says about China and India.
Measurements, which we are now concluding from Smith's finding, because we are simply talking about invisible hand, that should work. If we look theoretically that your self-interest motivates you, and then you're working, you are increasing your productivity. Then there is collusion, there's a problem. Smith was not in favor of government, but he was in favor of government just for the defense purpose, for other purposes. He never condemned the colonization of Great Britain or other areas. So those are the things which I'm asking, that if we come with the moral judgments of Adam Smith, it gives us impression that we are not talking about social science, which we studied in the books that Adam Smith introduced social science. So then it can become some sort of moral kind of judgment rather than a pure subject which we elude or which we refer to Adam Smith. So that was my question.
Right.
Thank you once again.
So if I understand it correctly, and please forgive me if I didn't, Smith does actually strongly criticize the British Empire. He's probably one of the strongest critics of the British Empire. And part of the motivations that he gives is because the British Empire causes constraints in growth. So I think Smith is a social scientist in the sense that he tries to identify what is fixed and what changes. Right? And so he looks at like, these are the things that we are starting with, this is our assumption. If we change the context, if we change the constraints, what's going to happen? But he also writes in a time in which he was a professor of moral philosophy, right? So one way for me to read The Wealth of Nations is actually to read it as a normative book, where he is making normative claims. So what he's saying about the merchants and manufacturers are normative claims. They are saying these are very bad behaviors, and they're bad behaviors not just because they cause inefficiencies, but because those inefficiencies are causing injustices. Right? So justice and efficiency for him go hand in hand, just like injustice, injustice, and inefficiency go hand in hand. So part of the criticism that he gives of the British Empire is because it is unjust. By constraining the market, by creating monopolies, you are preventing economic growth. And preventing economic growth for him, or at that time, meant you're causing death. Because we are not talking about a situation like today in which, yeah, you're poor, but you more or less can make it. Like in Smith's time, he tells you in the Highland of Scotland, which is a poor part of Britain, a woman gives birth to 20 children, only to see at best 2 of them grow to adulthood. Right? And that's because of poverty. That's because you don't have enough food to feed your children. So for Smith, not being able to grow economically means that you're not going to be able to support the life of your children, of the elderly, and of the sick. In the opening of The Wealth of Nations, introduction of the Wealth of that he wrote, of The Wealth of Nations, he writes, there are societies that are so miserably poor that people are forced to abandon their children, their infants, their elderly, and their sick. And I'm using his words, to be devoured by wild beasts. Okay. So imagine that do you have children? Yeah. When your baby is born, you have to say, I can't support him or her. And you're going to leave your baby in the street so that it will be devoured by a wild beast. It's a horrible thought. I mean, it doesn't say, oh yeah, you expose your children, which is a very discreet way of saying the same thing. He uses a very powerful image of your baby being eaten by a wild beast, or your elderly parent. Right? Is a very powerful image. And this is why I'm saying, like, that is what poverty for him means. That you're forced to let your children die, you're forced to let your elderly die because you don't have enough to support them. And that, I think, for him is a moral claim. Right? It's not just, oh yeah, you can produce more if you have more open markets. Like, no, you can actually let people live as opposed to be forced to let them to kill them in one way or the other. So I see the moral component in his arguments. Again, it comes from a time that is different from ours, in which economics is still embedded into all other sciences, including the moral philosophy. So the other problem that that emerges in Smith's account is the fact that there are different ability, the different groups have different ability to capture state power. And the problem is not that everybody should have the same power to access state power, is that you should not get state power. So the problem is not the government per se. The problem is that there are special interest groups that capture that force of the state to privilege themselves, again, at the expense of others. And so masters, merchants, manufacturers, those are all people that tend to live in cities, tend to be, therefore, to live next to each other, which means that they're concentrated, is easy for them to cartelize again. This is a beautiful public choice story that Smith is telling us here. The landlords, farmers are many, they are dispersed in the country, so it's very difficult for them to cartelize. And the problem is that the collusion of merchants, manufacturers, or masters is by itself is bad, but is even worse because, again, they are able to convince the legislators to pass laws or regulations that support them. So the equality of the law disappears because now you have groups that are able to receive privileges, to be treated differently, to have different access to resources than others. And usually those are groups that are benefiting themselves, but at the expense of others. So that's when there is a conflict. And I used a couple of citations here because it gives you a sense of how strong the words Smith uses. So merchants and manufacturers, the interest of merchants and manufacturers is never exactly the same with that of the public. They have generally an interest in to deceive and even oppress the public, and who accordingly have, on many occasions, both deceived and oppressed it. And they have extorted the legislature for the support of their own absurd and oppressive monopolies. Again, these are like two of the many citations that Smith, or many sentences that Smith uses to describe the, and I use the word, he doesn't, self-interest of merchants and manufacturers. He uses the word rapacity. Rapacity is when you are willing to take everything, you have patience, exactly.
You have done a lot of work. So have you ever seen this Adam Smith's view in perspective of South Asian economies? Because these economies are resource-rich economies, but underutilized resources are there. Our governments are acting there's different government structure, but we can link it with that. Market economy also exists there, and the behavior and the patterns, what you are discussing here. Have you ever seen them in this perspective, where the gaps exist? Because this is something, as earlier we have discussed, that according to the European economy, you are discussing all this. So we need another perspective also.
So I'm going to show you this level. because that's where he talks about the history. So his approach again is to see what
Britain is doing. And for him, Britain is doing a lot of awful things. And probably the most awful one is the support of the East Indian Company. He tells us, and I'm going to talk about this, and I hope that I'm answering part of your question, but I'm not sure I will be able to answer it completely. So he tells us that in theory, a sovereign has an interest in maintaining his society, his nation, his kingdom. Because a sovereign leaves his kingdom to his children. Right? So it's like your parents take care of their houses, their house, because they want to give it to you eventually, right? So there is this idea of passage, of inheritance. So in theory, the sovereign is supposed to take care of his kingdom because he leaves it to the heirs. The problem is that the sovereign, or the government in this case, supports also something like the East Indian Company, which for Smith is an institution that has the same power as the state, because it's a military, basically. But it doesn't have the same interest of the state, of the sovereign. So what he thinks is that the East Indian Company is an institution for extraction in the worst possible sense. So they came, they took as much as they could and left without thinking about the future. Because the officials of the East Indian Company do not leave to their children. So they take as much as they can from the country, say goodbye, and they leave, leaving destruction behind. So again, that's the extent to which Smith is thinking about India, or the subcontinent. And he sees it mostly as a British problem. So for him, Britain is doing bad things in being in India or in North America, for that matter. And he's hoping that the empire actually would break down, so that you would lose those kind of monopolies that you have here. It's very costly for Britain to maintain the East Indian Company. It's very expensive for Britain to maintain the North American colonies. So his perspective, again, is of a British citizen looking at what his government is doing, not just at home, but also to the colonies that they have. And his claim is that the entire British Empire is a product of merchants and manufacturers lobbying. So is a product of a special interest group, that they are the one, merchants and manufacturers, who push for the creation of the empire, for the creation of colonies and the maintenance of them, so that they can maintain monopoly powers over those regions. Again, that doesn't quite answer your question, I think, right?
Yes, it's a sort of discussion, not I need particular answers. But
Let her, because I think
basically finished.
only one
Yeah.
slide left, so you can finish your presentation and then
But maybe
we can. Okay.
please finish your question.
let me reframe my question. I want to let's replicate this model for South Asian countries. So where the gaps exist, that is my question.
Again, I think the Smith doesn't analyze India from an Indian perspective. He analyzes India as a British colony. And in that sense, he criticizes the British action over India, but it doesn't study whatever is there outside the British conquest. Does it sort of, yeah. So this opens the door to this last problem where two different interests actually collide and don't go in the same direction, so that the interest of society actually does not align with individual interests. I'd already mentioned that in theory, the interest of the sovereign should be in the same direction as the interest of society. Just like I mentioned, like the interest of you as a parent or of your parents is to maintain whatever you have so that you can give it to your children. In practice, again, that's not always the case, at least for the sovereign. Because the sovereigns face themselves with large expenses. They don't know how to pay for those expenses. And the easiest way for them is to debase the coins. Today, we would say it's to inflate the debt away. And by debasing the coins, what they're doing is, again, clashing with the interest of society. Mostly because the way in which Smith describes the debasing of coins is that one of the worst catastrophes that can happen. Mostly because of redistributions. Like the lenders are now left with basically nothing, and they're ruined. The sovereign, in theory, should care about merit and abilities of the people who work for him. Government officials should be there because of their merit and their abilities. But in reality, what Smith says, the sovereign prefers to surround themselves with people who flatter him, not with people who are competent. And the more you're surrounded with people that flatter you, the less competent, most likely, those flatterers are. And so what you're going to do are things that are not going to benefit society. The other problem that we may have, this comes from, again, this also comes from theory of moral sentiments, is that sometimes you may have very good intentions as a sovereign. In the US, we say that hell is paved with good intentions. And this would be an example of this. When you have a man of system, the way in which he calls is somebody has very good intention. He has this beautiful image of what society should be. And so he tries to implement this beautiful image of society, this beautiful system. He tries to implement it, but is an image. It is something that he creates in his own mind, and it doesn't necessarily work in practice. So when you try to implement this beautiful picture that you have in your mind, you're actually going to cause disasters because it doesn't work in practice. So again, you have another situation in which the interest of one person, of the sovereign in this case, clashes with the interest of society. And I already talked about the East Indian Company. And so I think that one of the lessons that we can take from the Wealth of Nations, especially when read in conjunction with the theory of moral sentiments, is that pursuing your own interest while taking into consideration the interest of others or the presence of others actually does benefit society. But when you pursue your self-interest by disregarding the interest of others, by disregarding the presence of others, by being willing to step over others, then you're going to have problems because your interest is going to clash with the interest of society.
Thank you so much, Professor Pagnelli. Only someone who has read Smith so deeply can, come up with such insights, because mostly Smith is equated with self-interest, and which actually leads to my first question. So in your work also, you have highlighted that self-interest is not optimizing calculus. There are other regarding preferences as well, which scholars like Amartya Sen has also, raised such concerns. So why is it that the neoclassical economics persist using, self-interest as the more main behavioral tool? Is it because of it is amenable to mathematical modeling, or is there any other historical fact that which has led to this? Secondly, my question is that your work emphasizes that markets are deeply conditional systems. You have also shown in that they are, a product of institutions prevailing at that time. And some of the questions also, highlighted that markets are not universal. The market system, the laissez-faire that Adam Smith talks about, they are not universal. They are modeled or influenced by the institutional structure of that time. So why is it that the policymakers see invisible hand as, as a universal tool? And why don't they, look into the fact that when it works, it does not work always, as you have said, that if in conjunction with self-interest, if invisible hand would not lead to the welfare of the society or even of the individual who is pursuing his or her own self-interest?
For the first question, I do suspect that you're right in saying that we lose self-interest as I don't think about anybody else. Oh, something. Sorry.
I don't think about anybody else but myself because it's easier to model. And there are attempts to, especially recently, to integrate others into my preferences, but it's the same process. So it's a very different situation, or it's a very different way of thinking that what Smith actually offers us, because the other is just another object in my utility function. I'm still a utility maximizer, right? And I'm not sure that Smith would actually see us as utility maximizer, right? But it's difficult and messy to include our moral sentiments in our models, especially if you're using math. So I think that there is a lot to it. My hope is that things will change just because at a certain point, like right now, we reach the dead end, right? Like there's only so much that economics can do in terms of explanatory powers. I mean, you have a lot of things that can be done through numbers, but a lot of things cannot. And your second question was about the embracement of laissez-faire. Smith never used the word laissez-faire. Yeah. Smith actually criticizes the people who use laissez-faire as a ideal. And maybe it goes back in part to the question of government intervention. Smith is perfectly comfortable to have government intervene in very specific situations. Defense is one, but it's not the only one. What Smith is afraid of is the government interventions that are the product of special interest groups. But that doesn't mean that he's not favoring government interventions at all. What is doing in after his death, Wealth of Nations was very, very popular. But in continental Europe, book 5 of the Wealth of Nations was actually the most read part of the Wealth of Nations, especially in Spain, mostly because it was thought as a tax manual. Right? Because like Smith tells you, well, these are the problems that you have with taxation, which are very difficult to solve. So we have to find a way to tax in an effective and fair ways. And so it was used as like, okay, let's see if we can learn something about how to actually tax and receive revenues. And Spain, being in financial difficulties, was very much looking into it. But that aside, I mean, in the book itself, there are a lot of actions for the government, so much so that some of the more laissez-faire oriented economists of the 20th century actually criticized Smith because it was not laissez-faire enough. But it wasn't. Like he saw that there are situations in which it is appropriate to build, if we call them party walls. The party walls are partitions among houses to prevent fires from burning the next house. Right? So again, you are in 18th century Britain, houses are made of wood, lights is done with fire, heating is done with fire, cooking is done with fire. The chances that your house burns down are very high. And if your house burns down, it's going to burn the next house, and it's going to burn the next house, and the whole London burns down. So how do you prevent it? You put party walls, partition, so that the fire actually doesn't go through. And Smith says, nobody wants those because they're ugly. But we have to have them. And so he offers a lot of examples of party walls, which he says are bluntly violation of liberty, but they're necessary. Right? So especially in banking, he offers suggestion to make the financial system safer, according to his thinking, which are regulations. He said, no, I know that you would like to have this, the other person would like to have it, but you're better off not. Those are the kind of government intervention that he is favoring. There are things that actually benefit the entire society, or they benefit certain less privileged groups. So again, in the banking situation, he wants to ban small denomination notes, not because society is going to be worse off with them, but because the working poor are going to be worse off with them. And they have no other option. Like there is no other solution to that problem but banning the small denomination notes. So he has a lot of situations in which he favors government intervention because he sees it as beneficial to society or beneficial to a group that otherwise would be oppressed. What he doesn't like, on the other hand, are the policies that favor one group at the expense of others. Those are the problems. But I wouldn't say that he would be like a laissez-faire economist. He's much more contingent and less doctrinary than some later economists would be.
I'm Mohammad Anis. I'm here as a PhD candidate studying at the Department of English. And so you talked about how in a capitalist economic system, masters can hold longer than the worker, right? When there is a protest going on and something like that. My question is that, so this is the time when he's writing the book, The Wealth of Nation. It is around 1776, I believe. And you mentioned, I think, in your talk that because the worker cannot, resist for long, so he must come to the negotiation table and work things out with the master. But I think that Adam Smith was wrong in assuming that the worker cannot to think of an alternative system, right? And within the next 10 years, we see that the French Revolution happened, right? And so the master is completely overthrown, right? And so I think this is kind of my comment, and I would like to make your comment, like to hear your comment on this. And the second thing is that could you little bit elaborate on how you mentioned that workers do not understand their own interest? Could you a little bit, elaborate on this? Yeah, thank you.
Good
Go ahead.
afternoon. I'm Dr. Idris Masood from the Area Study Center, University of Peshawar. My thinking is that it's about 300 years old theory by the Adam Smith. A lot of time has passed. In the 60s, the Keynesian Marshall adjunct consensus prevailed. It started from the 60s till the 80s. The Keynesian consensus survived till the 80s. Thereafter, along with the Washington consensus, there have been many consensuses. Dr. Maria, I think she wishes to enliven the invisible hand of the Adam Smith today. My humble opinion is that invisible hand is just a utopia, but if you want to see that transformed today into something better that can build a better world, then I would say that it would be the right hand, which is on the right side of the history, and which can enable translation of the right economic theories into the public policy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much once again giving me the opportunity. Actually, we were talking about the theory of moral sentiment, and that's one of your favorite books. So if I ask the question that we have moral sentiments, a lot of things about it, we start from the 10 commandments of Old Testament, then we come to the Bible, and then we come to Quran. And Quran is saying that وَأَوْفُوا الْكَيْلَ وَالْمِيزَانَ بِالْقِسْطِ. So weigh with justice and deliver justice. And then we say about intention, إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّاتِ. So your actions are judged by your intentions. So why then we see that Adam Smith became so popular when we had all these kinds of commandments, we have all these kinds of things, judgments. So my opinion in this sense, I'm looking for your answer, but at the same time, I want to share one thing, because that was the time when the mercantilists, they were going to fail. And the Europe needed another theory, alternate. Like when the classicals were going to fail, the Keynesians, Professor Saab just asked this question. He shared his views. So then we had Keynesian, and when Keynesians were failing, we had rational expectations. Probably this is one of the reasons that invisible hand, despite the fact that it did not work in 2008, we see the invisible hand completely failed. But still, the invisible hand is surviving. Why this is going on, despite the history of human being? We start from Socrates, we start from others, philosophers, we look into Mills, Bentham, we look into Hegel. Still, the Adam Smith in economics is very influential. Why this is going on? If you kindly elaborate this one. Thank you so much, sir.
To the first question about the workers, Smith tells you that the workers are too preoccupied, or not too busy, not preoccupied, with their own jobs. Again, they're working 15 hours a day, 6 days a week, from very young age. And so they are unable to understand what is good for them. And it's just because, again, they haven't had the chance to develop any judgment, any critical thinking. Because when you start as a little boy to do the same thing over and over and over again, that's the only thing that you know how to do. And they, therefore, for Smith, are prey to factions. So when the masters intimidate, or the merchants and manufacturers intimidate the legislator, it's not that the masters are the ones that are actually going and beat up the legislators. They are going to tell the workers, go and protest because they're doing something wrong. So the workers are objectified, in a sense, by the faction leaders, and they are pushed in different directions according to their will. And so the workers are going to ask for certain things, not because that is actually good for them. They don't understand that what is good for them or not good for them. Usually what they're asking for are things that are bad for them, but they're good for the merchants and manufacturers. So that's the context in which Smith is saying that the workers don't understand their own interest. Just they didn't have the time to think about it. That they answer your question?
Right.
Let me start with your question, and then I go to the online question, because I think they are related somehow. In Theory of Moral Sentiments, Smith describes how we develop morality, but it doesn't give us any content of morality. Okay. So he never mentioned any of the religious doctrines. So it simply tells you we develop a sense of what is right and what is wrong, but it doesn't tell you what is right and what is wrong. So in that sense, it doesn't quite work with the Ten Commandments or the Quran. It just like it doesn't fit his explanation. So it describes the mechanism, not the content itself. The invisible hand, which I think goes also to the previous question, to the online question, is it utopian? Why are we still thinking and talking about it when we have obvious failures like 2008? And I fear that one of the challenges that we have is to distinguish, oh no, there's no longer the PowerPoint, that's okay, to distinguish a regular market society or a regular market from cronyism. And the butcher, the brewer, and the baker are led by the invisible hand. Right? So the benefits that you have to society comes from the butcher, the baker, and the brewer, not from cronyism. The two are not the same. So there is a difference between my baker and the guild or the associations of tobacco merchants, just using Smith's examples. They're not the same. The tobacco merchants are lobbyists, can be cronists. My baker is just my baker. So the invisible hand works for situations like the baker, the brewer, and the butcher, where you have small producers that are not cartelizing. They are in a very competitive environment. There's many of them. And so competition actually prevents the cartelization. But to say that 2008 is a failure of the invisible hand, I would say yes, if the invisible hand is what today's economists think it is. But no, if you think of what Smith thinks it is. Because the 2008 financial crisis dealt with a lot of cronies. Right? So there's a lot of protections, a lot of privileges that are given to certain industries as opposed to others that probably Smith would not be enthusiastic about. So I think yes, it may be utopian to think in terms of the invisible hand, but on the other hand, there are forces that we experience daily, right? We are all fed, like we are all clothed. And those are things that I think are part of the idea of invisible hand. So that my baker or the person in the hotel this morning who prepared my breakfast didn't prepare it for me specifically. Right? He prepared it because he received a salary. That doesn't mean that he poisoned me, right? It means like he did his job. I ate my breakfast. We are both happy, and that's the end of it. But it's a very different story than having big corporations achieving privileges and obtaining privileges than that the cook in my hotel that prepares my breakfast. So it is utopian to think that every single activity will be the same. And this is why I think Smith is actually a very, very good economist, because it tells you there are situations that have a very competitive environment that actually work well. But we are aware of the fact that there are situations where it doesn't work. And it doesn't work because we have this tendency to cartelize, and we should try to push it back if possible.
Dr. Madhiha Riaz here. So I have first of all, thank you so much for such an insightful discussion and topic. So I would like to just ask one thing, that when we are talking about invisible hands and we challenge it, so it means we are basically shaking the whole the foundation of economics, because the whole foundation of economics is based on the self-interest and everything that. So it means we have to work for the foundation first. Like when we say that we are working for invisible hand, and our utility is basically based on our decision, behind that is invisible hand of self-interest. So you are right, when we are taking into account the if we taking into account the utility with respect to society, then the utility will be enhanced as compared to when we are just taking our own self-interest. So I would like to just ask that if we want to the whole foundation of obviously when we say that there is no invisible hand, and we have to take into considerations the society and welfare, our utility will be enhanced and maximized, because U1 and plus U2, that is the societal utility. And in similarly, when we talk about the another side, that if we are taking into considerations our utility with respect to this life and afterlife, then utility will be more enhanced, in the sense when the welfare is maximizing in the society due to our acts, our utility after death will also be enhanced in the whole concept. Then if my question simply is that how can we work for the foundation in that direction? And when we say that because already you mentioned that invisible hand is already failed in economics, so it means we have to work for the foundation again, and based on the utility maximization, which will be more than as compared to when we are talking about invisible hands. So my question is, how can we work for that, we change the whole foundation of economics based on considerations, the societal like utility and everything related to that. Thank you.
I wish I had a good answer for this question. It's a fabulous question. And I don't have a good answer. But it is true that what I think Smith is doing, or one way to read Smith today, is to challenge the foundations of economics as we know it, or as we were taught, and we are still teaching. There are some programs that are attempting to reshape the foundations of economics by reintroducing the ideas that Smith had. And these are coming from a Nobel Prize winner in economics. His name is Vernon Smith. He works with another economist, an experimental economist called Bart Wilson. They have a program called Humanomics, which is an attempt to reintroduce a human into economics, because the way in which economics is done today is basically without human beings. A rat maximizes utility just like human being does. So there is no difference in our utility maximization. You can study exactly in the same way humans and non-humans. But we are not rats. We are a special kind of animals. And both Adam Smith, and some of the behavioral economists that are working right now are realizing that there is a big difference between humans and other species of animals. We trade, and we are the only creature that actually trade. And Smith realized it without knowing anything about primates or zoology. But apparently we are the only creatures that actually is able to foresee the benefits of an exchange. So to model our behavior as you can model rats can be useful, but is limited. If you want to understand human actions, then you do need to study human beings with their special attributes. So yes, we have a lot of things in common with other species, and that's great. We can use other species to learn about ourselves, but we also have to realize that we are special in a sense, being trading creatures. And that foundation of seeing ourselves as trading creature is absent from economics today, is quite sadly to say. And you can see it also in textbooks, right? Like usually principles of economics start with utility maximization. And then eventually you get to exchange. Wealth of Nations opens with exchange. And there is no utility maximization. So there are indeed some differences, and it's not going to be easy to rethink of those foundations and to start working with a foundation that puts humans as human beings at the starting point of the discipline. Inertia is unfortunately or fortunately a very strong force. But I was mentioning yesterday, you can study human beings without studying meanings. But if you think of a human being, we actually give meanings to our actions, even when we go buy or sell. So to be able to use meanings in a meaningful way is hard. It's very hard, and it's something that completely alien to a neoclassical trained economist.
Thank you so much, Professor Pagnelli. That was a wonderful talk, and thank you so much for your patience. So her talk shows that it is very narrow concept, and that too, misinterpreted, that is being used in economics today. The conventional economics, as Professor said, that there are many other strands that are working to redefine the core of economics. And when I teach history of economic thoughts, my students ask, why do we need to study history of economic thought? I think this lecture shows that we do need to study history of economic thought, because the modern economics claims that it has solved all the problems that Adam Smith and Karl Marx and Ricardo had, but it hasn't. So we need to study history of economic thought. And some of the questions also highlighted that rather than relying on secondary texts, it is very important to read original text in economics. Thank you so much, Professor. It was a wonderful talk. It was very nice hearing you.